Welcome. My name is Stephen Hyder, and I'm the chair of the Department of Economics. I'm so glad you are virtually joining us in East Lansing tonight. On my walks through campus the last several days, I'm happy to report that there's plenty of evidence that spring has sprung. The trees are starting to bloom, the red cedar is running high, and students are out about, often in their hammocks, something that I wish I had when I was a student. Our campus is as beautiful as ever. Tonight, I'm happy to be hosting our fourth annual Alumni Webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to both showcase the research of our current faculty and to allow you, our alumni, to connect with the department and college. Tonight's lecture is by Professor Emilie Jackson. Emilie received her PhD from Stanford University. She joined the MSU faculty in 2021 after completing a postdoc at the NBER. Emilie's area of specialty is public finance and labor economics, working on topics such as health insurance, the labor market of older workers, in addition to what she's talking about this evening. Tonight, Emilie will be talking about the gig economy and its potential to shape the future of work in the United States. Emilie will discuss what we know about the prevalence of gig work and the individuals who undertake it. She will discuss how the structure of gig work differs from more traditional employment relationships. Here's the plan for the rest of the evening. I will be turning the reins over to Emilie momentarily, who will give about a 30-minute lecture. After that, I will return and moderate a question and answer session, both based on questions that have been submitted in advance and those that are posted in the Q&A this evening. With that, I now turn the webinar over to Professor Emilie Jackson.
Thanks, Stephen. Let me just share my slides. Okay, you should be able to see, hopefully you can see the slides. So I'm going to talk about my research studying the gig economy tonight. And a lot of my research has been looking at the gig economy back since its inception. And so I'll give you some context of what I'm thinking about, but I'll pay a particular attention to my work that studied the gig economy or platform gig work in recent years. So this is going to draw from several different papers of mine as we go through the work, and I'm happy to share those papers after if anyone is interested. So the prevalence of gig work and contract work is going to be important from a labor economic standpoint. And there's been a lot of attention in the media, both recently and going back to the innovation of platform work. And so with these new platform work type of work that has appeared, there was a lot of news articles and a lot of discussion sort of on the policy front about whether or not these new types of platforms and the workers on them are going to change how we think about the labor market. Okay. And so just to preface, so before we dive into more current numbers, I want to show you what online platform work looks like going back to about 2012 when it really started to take off. So if you look at the graph that I have displayed on the screen here, if you see the red circles, the difference between the red circles and the unfilled in red circles are going to be what's called online platform work. And so online platform work, I'll dig deeper into how I'm going to define it in our research later, but think of new platforms like Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, Airbnb, any of these online platforms that create a form of employment for individuals that didn't previously exist before these apps. Okay. And so there's been a lot of attention about people earning income on these types of platforms. And that really started back, as you can see here, about 2012. And so one takeaway here is that this has been growing quite dramatically, and that's why we have this increased attention on this type of work. But what you can also see is that the red dashed line includes this broader group of individuals who are contract workers more generally. And so I'll come back to this later on, but these online platform workers are actually a subset of contract work. And contract work, we know, has existed for many, many years, and that is not a new phenomenon. So I will spend a bit of time in the data section distinguishing what is new and what isn't. Okay? The key thing here is that with these new inventions and these new platforms, there's been a lot of debate because of the attention on this employee-employer relationship about whether or not these type of workers should be classified as employees or as contract workers. And so that's where a lot of the media attention has been focused. And so what I'll point out is that in the sort of labor market in the policy spectrum in the US, many economic policies are actually designed around traditional employment. And so as we have a rise in contract work, as you can see through the red line here, these policies are going to be less effective when we have increasing individuals working in types of work that are not actually covered by them. So think about things like employer provided benefits. So if you're a wage worker, you're going to get things like health insurance from your employer. If you're a contract worker, you're not going to have the same benefits. There's other things like workplace protections. You can think of things like workers' comp, minimum wage generally is not going to apply either. And things like unemployment insurance are generally designed around traditional wage work. And so I'll actually come back and talk a little bit about unemployment insurance during the COVID pandemic later in this talk. So before I go into that time period, I just want to pause briefly on this graph that I have over here and sort of highlight what in my early work in this area we know about these types of workers. So when you look at online platform work in its early days, generally speaking, the online platform workers are going to look slightly different than typical 1099 and contract workers. Okay? So the main growth that we saw between 2000 and 2018 came from online platform work, which you can see, hopefully you can see my mouse, but you can see by this difference between the two red lines. That's the growth in online platform work. If you exclude online platform work, the contract work levels as a share of the overall workforce are actually quite steady during that time period. So there's relatively little change in contract work prevalence during this time period. The change is largely driven by these new platforms. And other things that we know about online platform work during this time period is that generally speaking, most of the individuals working on these platforms, at least in these early days, were doing it as a supplemental way of earning. So a lot of them had wage jobs as their main job. This was supplemental earnings to their main source of income. And many people, therefore, were not working necessarily full time, and they were earning small amounts of income. And then finally, a lot of the, if you think about it just in terms of total employment, the majority of the employment was concentrated among transportation-based apps. And we'll also talk about a bit about how that changed during COVID. So where are we going to go and think about today? Well, COVID during the pandemic, there's a lot of questions that came up about whether or not this is going to be a pivotal time for these types of platforms. And so you can search the internet and find all sorts of articles saying this was the best time for gig economy, this was the worst time. Gig workers are now going to become entrepreneurs. You can find sort of any type of article that you want if you search. And so really it's an important question to actually dig into the numbers and try and understand, one, how gig work has changed or platform work has changed during this time period, and two, how different policies may have interacted with that change. And so that's going to be the main thing that I'm going to talk about. So hopefully I've convinced you so far that it's important to understand from a policy perspective and from a labor economics perspective, what is the prevalence of contract work? How is gig work fitting into the overall labor market? And that I think is important for a few things. Well, one, as the labor market is changing, we want to understand where these workers fit into the labor market. And two, in terms of implementing policy, we want to know what policies are either non-existent for these types of workers or interact with the form of employment that they're doing. Okay. And so what what I will say is that the economic and policy landscape that happened during the COVID pandemic are going to be non-ignorable in the sense that we can't just take these estimates from prior to 2018 and extend them forward and expect the patterns to have stayed the same, right? There were large simultaneous changes in the composition of work. Many people were laid off from wage work during the time period. Many people have had care responsibilities and so forth. So there was a large compositional shift in the types of work that people were doing and whether or not people were looking for new forms of work. And additionally, we had new policy that had not existed before for gig workers. So one example of that is going to be what's called the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, which I'll give you more details on later in the talk. But essentially what this effectively did is extend what you can think of as traditional unemployment insurance to gig workers for the first time. And so as you know, as a labor economist, this is a great opportunity to understand how this policy affected individuals and their earnings, and to help use these, hopefully then policymakers can use these going forward to understand how to best design policies. So, you know, if you want just one simple question I'm going to talk about today is thinking about how the gig economy has evolved and changed during this COVID time period. So I'm really going to zoom into 2020, 2021. Those are going to be the most recent years of data that we have. And I'll show you all of the research that we have done, or not all of it. I'll give you a preview of the research that we have done using tax filings. So today I'm going to divide the talk into two sections. So first, I'm going to give you a sort of an overview and some summary statistics, try and really show you what the data shows us about how the platform gig economy evolved during this time period. What changes did we see? What compositional shifts did we see in terms of demographics, so on and so forth. And then I'm going to dig into the policy side and see how entry and exit into this form of work may have correlated with different policies. Okay. So with that, I'm going to start very simply by telling you how we're going to measure gig work, because I think this will be very important to distinguish who we're going to count in each group and who is not going to be counted, okay? And so this will come back to, you know, many of you have probably seen various news articles. You can see numbers as high as 30% of the work economy is gig work. You can see numbers as low as 1%. It really is going to depend on how you measure it. And so that's going to be a key difference of why people get such vastly different numbers, okay? So let me start by talking about the gig online platform economy. So I really am going to spend the bulk of today thinking about online platform economies. And in our papers, we're going to distinguish this as a subset of gig workers. So gig workers you can think of as the broader group of contract workers, whereas those specifically working on these new online platform economy is what I'm going to focus in on, as I think this is the sort of novel type of work that's really been growing in the last decade. So the way to think about these, and I can't provide you what services may or may not be included in the data, but these are the types of services you should have in mind. The images come from Forbes, and JP Morgan Chase Institute has a very nice definition that is the following. The online platform economy is going to connect workers with customers via an online platform. So that's where the platform part is going to come in. Individuals are going to work for as long as or as little as they want. And they're going to be paid based on the task or service for which they perform, right? So they're not some on a long wage contract like a salary employee. And then finally, the payment is going to be arranged through the platform, okay? So these are sort of key characteristics that bring together what we think of as the online platform. In our data, the way we're going to identify these types of workers is we're going to draw on the universe of individual tax filings and information returns for the years going back to 2000 to 2021. And the key unique feature here is that individuals who work on these platforms will receive forms that are referred to as a 1099 MISC or newly called 1099 NEC forms. If you've ever done any contract work and earned income above $600, you may have received one of these forms. If you have not done any contract work in your life, you may have received a W-2 from salary work. You can think of a 1099 form as being very similar to a W-2, but it's issued instead of to an employee, but to a contractor who's performed some set of tasks for a firm. Okay. So the way to think about this is going to capture people who are working as contractors, but through a firm. So they're firm-based contractors. These are not independent contractors who are think of as a sole proprietor running their own business, right? They're not going to necessarily be firm-facing. They're going to be their own entity. So we're really thinking about people who are interacting in some way with a firm. In this case, they're going to be these new online platforms. Okay. And then in terms of thinking about what we see in the data and what I'm going to talk about today is these individuals are going to be characterized from a tax perspective as self-employed individuals. So that's sort of where the economy has landed on these individuals as of right now. And so they're going to file expenses, receipts, and so forth as if they were a self-employed individual. Okay. So other forms of characteristics, I can link together various data. So we're going to know people's gender, their age, their household structure, and so forth. And so I can give you a little bit of characteristics of what these type of workers are and how this fits into their broader income portfolio. So just to be clear for what I've just said, the way that you can think of workers as being classified in the labor market. So on the left-hand side, we have employees, right? So that's if you're employed by an employer, you're a salary worker, then you receive a W-2 form. We think of you as a wage worker. Gig workers are really going to be this set of independent contractors who are going to be firm-facing and receive these 1099 forms, okay? And so we're going to look at the subset of individuals who receive these 1099 forms from these new online platform economies, okay? And then finally, I want, again, just to reemphasize, keep these separate for now from other self-employed individuals, which you can think of as individuals who are maybe running a small business or so forth, okay? So with that, I'm going to sort of step away from all of the gory details of data and sort of give you a high level summary of how gig work has evolved. So gig work has grown substantially during the pandemic, right? So the question was, is the pandemic going to be a make or break moment for this form of work? And it actually grew by over 3 million individuals. If you look at 2019 through 2021, this increased by over 150%. And if you look at the breakdown in the types of work that people are doing, transportation continues to be the most important subsector of platform work. If you break down, so I want you to look on the left-hand side right now. If you look at transportation and delivery platforms, the majority of these individuals are still earning small amounts of money. So most of this activity is for less than $20,000. So that has not changed. In fact, that share has in fact grown over this time period. So that's sort of the characteristics in terms of earnings haven't changed. But we can't break down the difference between rideshare and food delivery in our data, but we can turn to other data to look at that type of thing, right? So you may think, well, the pandemic was not a great time for rideshare. And in fact, that is true if you look at the numbers on the left-hand side here. If you look at New York City and Chicago public use data, rideshare plummeted, not surprisingly, during this time period. People were staying home and traveling less often, so rideshare was not a popular phenomenon. But as we saw, gig work was growing. And as many of us probably did during this time, deliveries, as you can see on the right-hand side, was increasing dramatically. So while people may not have been going and traveling as much, they were in fact ordering delivery, whether that was from restaurants or groceries and so forth. And so on net, we know that the gig economy grew, and that's largely driven by these delivery-based platforms. Other interesting phenomenon, and so perhaps this is not surprising, the geographic distribution of gig work is skewed towards more urban areas. So I'm showing you this at the state level, but if you were to zoom into metropolitan areas as well, this is going to be largely concentrated in cities, where this is most popular, right? If we're in, say Idaho or Wyoming, if things are going to be more sparse, it's going to be harder to have a large share of the workforce working on platforms. Whereas if you're in New York City or Los Angeles, for instance, there's going to be a higher prevalence of gig work in the workforce. And then this result I actually find very interesting. So one thing that happened during this time period is that platform gig work shifted in terms of age and gender. So we shifted from a predominantly male dominated sector to being, so the breakdown was, if you look on the left hand side in transportation, which again is the majority of platforms, in 2019, 64% were male and 36% were female, whereas by 2021, this shifted to 44% female and 56% male. Okay. So part of this may be the shift that we saw in transportation and delivery, right? I don't have any causal evidence on that, but that's, one speculation. And so that'll be interesting going forward. What was it, the characteristics that brought more female participation? Additionally, we see a shift in terms of the distribution towards a younger population as well, right? So there's more younger people doing it during this time period. In terms of thinking about, so part of thinking about part of the research that I do is also thinking about the tax perspective of this. And so as many of these individuals are first-time self-employment or self-employees, they don't have familiarity with how to file taxes as a self-employed individual, right? As I mentioned before, many of these people hold a traditional wage job as their main job, or they've lost a wage job and then taken up these positions, right? And so if this is your first time filing your taxes as a self-employed individual, there is going to be, some confusion. And so what you can see in this blue line here is that there's a declining rate of Schedule C filing. And so I won't talk a lot about that today, but this just is a signal of increased participation among newly self-employed individuals who are just learning how the tax system works for self-employment. Okay, and so the punchline of what I want to talk about today is thinking about the churn among gig workers. So I've shown you that the gig work has grown by 150% over this time period, but that masks the fact that there was actually record entry and exit during the time period, right? So there's going to be contrasting dynamics. So both eligibility for PUA benefits are going to lead many incumbent gig workers to stop working during COVID. That's going to be the second portion of my talk here. And at the same time, we're going to have a huge influx of new entrants, right? That has to counteract the exit that we're seeing, because on net, we know that there's very large increase. Okay? So let's just first very briefly look at where the new entrants are coming from. And if you look at the type of W-2 work people were doing in 2019, so take salary workers, say what industry were they working in? And then you take that industry and you can say, how hard was that industry hit by COVID? Did that industry experience a substantial number of layoffs or high unemployment during COVID? We're going to be able to measure that by what share of that industry received UI. Okay, again, these are wage workers. And so industries, what you can see on the x-axis here is industries that received more UI in 2020. So these are industries we would expect to be harder hit. So on the right-hand side, I have some examples: arts, entertainment, and recreation, accommodations, and food services, right? These were very hard hit industries that a lot of people received UI. You also see a large number of these people entering now into gig work, right? So there's a correlation between entry into gig work and whether or not you are in an industry where you may have had a higher chance of losing your job during the pandemic, right? So that gives some background on where entry may be coming from. And I want to spend the rest of my time talking about exit and thinking about policies that may be coming and policymakers have talked about and were implemented for the first time during COVID. Given the time, I'm just going to very briefly put this in context. The online platform economy is very unique during this time period. So this is going to be the bright red color up here, right? So online platform economy is going to be growing, as I mentioned, but the rest of contract work you can see is actually declining or staying relatively the same. So this isn't some broader trend that happened in 2020 and 2021 where people really took up contract work. It was really taking up platform work specifically. If anything, on net, 1099 contract work declined. And that holds true regardless of if you break this down by any of the sub-industries. So these are 2-digit NICS codes. And so regardless of what sub-industry you look at, all ones except platform work were decreasing if you compare 2020 to 2018. Same is true if you compare 2021 to 2018. Okay, so this is a unique phenomenon among platform gig workers. Okay, so that's also going to be motivation for why I'm going to focus on their growth today. So I'm going to just give you some brief overview on what the policy sort of framework is here. And so in your days at MSU, you may have learned about unemployment insurance if you took labor economics. The point of unemployment insurance is to help insure workers against idiosyncratic firm risk, right? Or unexpected aggregate economic downturns. The major gap in the system is that self-employed and marginally attached workers are not eligible or covered by this. And largely this is due to a system if you think about unemployment insurance, you have a firm or an employer who's going to certify that you can no longer work. That does not exist in the self-employment world. And so you have concerns about moral hazard and work disincentives. So that's sort of one side of the story. The other side of the story is you still want to help cover self-employed individuals who are still going to face these aggregate economic downturns, and you want to give some unemployment coverage during that time period as well. So those are sort of the two sides of the coin that policy is trying to think about. So during the pandemic, we had pandemic unemployment assistance, which was the first time that the US really expanded UI to cover all workers, including self-employed individuals. And so what we do in this paper, which I'll briefly talk through today, and I'll point you to the paper if you want to learn more, is look at whether or not the behavioral responses that we see are similar to those of traditional wage workers, right? Since this policy has never existed before, we have no sense of how gig workers are going to respond. So just as brief background, this is showing you coverage rates, so not take-up rates, just whether or not your job is going to be covered by UI. That has been increasing back from the 1970s. It's increased by 30 percentage points. But you can see even in 2020, there is about a 10% gap of traditional UI, right? This gap is largely self-employed individuals who are not covered by the current UI system. So the PUA system came in place during the pandemic because not only were wage workers affected by the pandemic, but also self-employed individuals by the economic downturn. And they modeled it after what is called disaster unemployment assistance, which was a very small program that was designed after or implemented during Hurricane Katrina as one main example. In the way the program worked is it covered individuals who are not covered or eligible under traditional UI. So the key is that you had to not be eligible under UI. So say you had a main wage job and you also worked for gig work on the side, well, you would be eligible under your main wage job for traditional UI, therefore you wouldn't be eligible for PUA. Okay. So in the paper, we study all of two of these different groups. We look at self-employed more generally. We also look at new entrants to the workforce. So think about graduating high school seniors, graduating college students who may have otherwise been able to find a job, but were not able to because of the economic conditions, right? These are all individuals who would not be covered under traditional UI, but may benefit from the PUA program, okay? Today, I'm only going to focus on online platform work just in the interest of time. And so let me just dive into what we see with this group. Okay. So the key is that this program was federally funded, but was administered at the state level. And so what that means is each state UI office processed all of the applications. And so while there was a federal regulation, the guidance was left up to the states to decide what constituted an ability to work or not work. As a result, the guidance was relatively broad. A driver for a rideshare service may qualify for PUA benefit if he or she has been forced to suspend operations as a direct result of COVID-19. Okay, so this is an example of the DOL letter. And so what you can imagine from an empirical standpoint is that each state may take this statement and interpret it a little bit differently. And what we see in practice is that states are going to have different interpretations of how generous they're going to interpret this statement. I'll come back to that in terms of our research design. But first, I just want to highlight that the PUA program, which is in red here, was very large. So in blue, these are going to be claims from traditional UI, right? PUA isn't going to peak as high as traditional UI, but is still a very massive program that had many individuals benefiting from this program, okay? What we're going to do to identify the effect of PUA generosity is we're going to zoom into state-county borders. So what is that going to do? There's going to be two factors that drive generosity variation across states, okay? One is going to be that different states are going to experience different levels of pandemic and economic conditions, right? So one state may have worse economic conditions than another. That type of variation we want to hold constant, right? That is not the type of variation we want to use to identify the effect of the policy. What we want to leverage is the fact that one state interpreted the generosity a little different than another state. And so by zooming into these state borders, we can look at two people. So you can think of someone living in Illinois versus Indiana, or Indiana versus Michigan, or Michigan versus Ohio, right? If you zoom into all of these borders, you can see the color denoting the generosity are all quite different. And then you can identify what is the effect of having a more generous UI offering versus a less generous UI offering, holding constant the economic conditions, okay? So this is going to be our main research design. I will talk it over sort of at a high level, and happy to go into the details if you want to talk in more details about the research design. What all of the Greek letters are going to mean here, what I have highlighted in red is going to be a fixed effect that identifies which border county pair are you in. So are you in the county in Michigan next to the county in Indiana? Are you in the county in Michigan next to the county in Ohio? So on and so forth. And then we're going to measure here what is the generosity level of your state. So were you in a more generous state or a less generous state, just in terms of how their office interpreted the policy. And so what that's going to give you is this beta G here, which is going to tell you the reduced form effect of being in a state that pays out $1 more in UI. How does that affect your earnings? And then we're going to go one step further. If you remember back to your classes where you learned about instrumental variables, we're going to take an IV approach and say, what is the effect of you earning $1 additional in UI on your earnings? Okay. So there's some key identification assumptions that I'm going to very briefly talk about just in the interest of time, because I know that we want to save some time for Q&A. But the key identifying assumption is really thinking about people when you zoom into about a 15 to 20 mile radius of the border, that people on one side of the border versus the other are going to be facing similar labor market conditions, right? And so what we're really holding constant is the economic conditions, the pandemic conditions, and we're really just leveraging. The only difference is how much benefits in UI you got if you applied, okay? So here are going to be our main results. In blue are going to be the gig platform workers, and in red are going to be all self-employed, excluding platform workers. So remember, all other contract workers. So on average, a self-employed individual was going to reduce for each additional dollar in UI that they receive, they reduce their earnings by about 30 cents. Whereas gig platform workers, when they get an additional dollar of UI, are reducing their earnings by almost 49 cents on the dollar, okay? In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the heterogeneity. If you look through the heterogeneity, there really is not, you'll notice that the bars are overlapping. There's not a lot of substantial differences across ages, gender. The only spot where you see differences in heterogeneity is when you look at income. So you see a larger response among higher income individuals. So I want to just put some discussion on this. So what can we compare these numbers to? Well, we can look at what studies have shown in terms of behavioral responses to UI generosity during the Great Recession, for instance. That's another time where there were large increases in UI generosity, and we could measure what the behavioral response is. So in our study, we find much larger effects. And that's, there's two things going on here. Well, one, the difference with PUA is now you're extending it to self-employed individuals, which you have not done before. And perhaps there's more discretion over take-up. Again, you don't have an employer who is able to certify who's able to take up this work or not. And I'm actually going to dig into that a little bit more in the last few minutes that we have. But that actually poses the question, right? We're only seeing about 30 cents reduction in earnings on the dollar. Why is this effect not actually larger, right? We would, ex ante, we might think that there actually would be a larger behavioral response than we actually observe. And that's because for many workers, even if they chose to keep working rather than claim UI, there was no work to be had because of the sectoral demand that had sort of collapsed due to the economic conditions, right? So they could either receive UI benefits or continue working and earn very little, in which case they're not reducing their earnings anyway. So just to make that clear in terms of a pictorial example, on the x-ante, I'm going to show you, or on the x-axis, sorry, I'm going to show you what the potential earning opportunities are. And so if you think about sectors that were really hard hit during the pandemic, you can think about personal care services, right? At the beginning of the pandemic, many of us were cutting our own hair. We weren't going to the hair salon, things like that, right? So these were sectors where there was very little earning opportunities, even if an individual was to continue running their self-employment business, right? And so you would expect then that you see a very small reduction in earnings due to increased UI benefits, right? If they were to keep working, they wouldn't earn anything anyway. And so how can they reduce their earnings by a lot? Whereas other sectors like the online platform economy were thriving. And so if you were to continue working in these types of sectors, you could have had a lot of earnings by continuing to work, right? So these are the types of sectors we would expect to have very large reductions in earnings in response to more UI benefits, right? You're giving up more earnings when you choose to stop working to take the UI benefits instead, right? And so we can actually map this out when we examine the data. And so if you look at the reductions for things like child care services, personal services, right? These individuals were in sectors that were very hard hit, and they have very small reductions in earnings as a behavioral response to the UI generosity. Whereas things like platform gig work, which actually were doing quite well during the pandemic, have larger behavioral responses. And if you look at this overall, you see a downward trend. So the larger or things like real estate, insurance, other sectors that were doing very well during the pandemic, right? They're going to have much larger behavioral responses. And with that, I think I'm almost out of time. So I just want to pose a couple of questions and highlight some points here. So while we do find in our study that PUA benefits do lead to some reduction in labor supply, this is not necessarily a bad case because, again, an adverse result because the policy was not only designed to help individuals smooth their income from losses in the labor market during this time, it was to help enable workers to remain safe from COVID. And so in another part of the paper, we look at health outcomes. And we find that among older gig workers, that this was linked to reduced exposure to COVID and reduced mortality among these workers as well. So that was another facet of the policy to keep in mind during this time period. But overall, we hope that these can be helpful in terms of estimates when policymakers are thinking how to best design UI for self-employed individuals. And just to recap, work on delivery platforms exploded during this time period. Despite the work disincentives that we saw, this was swamped by new entry. We saw 150% growth in the platform economy. Many people were entering it from wage work during this time period. And overall, like if you take a step back, contract work or a self-employment work generally didn't change much during this time period. Okay. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and then we're going to enter a Q&A portion.
Thank you, Emily. Now I'm partial. I'm a labor economist, so I like thinking about gig work, but a lot of other people like to think about it too. The first question I want to ask you was one that one of our attendees submitted to the Q&A. Please feel free to continue to put questions in the Q&A. I'll ask as many as I can. The attendee pointed out that UI, of course, is mostly funded by payroll taxes. There were no payroll taxes being paid for these gig workers. Who the heck paid for PUA?
So that's a great question. And so one thing with PUA that is unique is, yes, these are workers who did not pay into the PUA or into the UI system, which is why these workers are traditionally not covered. And so that's one reason to think that why these responses were it's an unanticipated surprise that you're suddenly eligible for UI. So that's one reason why you think these behavioral responses might be different than if we created a system where PUA or self-employed workers actually paid into a UI system. So the PUA program was funded federally by the CARES Act. So it was under the CARES Act umbrella and was funded federally. In terms of going forward, a lot of the policy discussion is whether or not we fold unemployed or self-employed individuals into a UI system. And then if you do that, you're going to have to think through how you actually set up a UI system where these types of workers are going to pay into it. So this, I think, is a unique circumstance where it wasn't, set up in a way that you would actually anticipate going forward. They were not paying into the system, but going forward, if you were to design a system, you would have to think of a way to set that up. And so there are ways in the I'm not a policymaker, so I don't have the perfect answer for this, but there are ways that they've designed for self-employment individuals to pay the employer side of employment taxes, for instance. So I'm sure there is a way that they could design, sort of a system like that where workers could pay UI and enter that as well. But
Another attendee tonight wanted to know about the age structure of gig workers. And I believe she was interested not just Do they tend to be older? Do they tend to be younger? But also something about turnover. Are they more like, are older workers more likely to persist as gig workers? What do you know about the age of gig workers?
That's a really great question. And I will be honest that I don't have a great answer in the sense that I don't have a breakdown of the entry and exit by age. I will say that in other work that I've done previously that is not in this sort of time era, but I've looked at people who have lost their job and whether or not they enter into gig work and sort of how that fits into their life cycle. And when I do that, I've broken that down by age. And if you look at older workers, for instance, it's actually a beneficial thing for older workers when they take up gig work. It helps take, they were instead relying on things like SSDI or which is Social Security Disability Insurance, or starting to withdraw retirement benefits. And so this provides older workers with an opportunity to continue working. Whereas in that case, when you look at younger workers, they stay in these types of positions and it actually crowds out their return to traditional wage work, which if you take a step back and you think about, well, what are sort of the negatives of the gig economy? It is flexible. That's a great, benefit. But on the flip side is there's no job ladder, right? So if you think about a traditional job, there's a job ladder, you can get a promotion, you can increase your earnings. Whereas the gig economy, you can think of as being somewhat more static, right? You can work more or less hours, but your pay is pretty proportional to the work that you do. There's no sort of promotional hierarchy. And so a lot of what happens when younger individuals stay in this type of work is they're foregoing all of those future earnings they could have if they followed that trajectory in a traditional wage job. So that's not fully a perfect answer to your question, but some things that I can tell you about differences across ages.
Some of your comments there points me to one of the questions we got in advance from a 1968 alum who was much more suspicious about the impact of the gig work. And the way that he posed the question was, to what extent do you believe individuals are forced into gig work based on the lack of job prospects in more traditional firms?
Yeah, so it's a great question as well. I think the one way I would think about it is there's many different types of gig workers. So there are certainly individuals who are taking up gig work following unemployment. We see that there's a lot of correlation between how hard your wage job industry was hit during COVID, for instance, and what entry into gig work was. So that suggests that there is some truth to that. As a share of the total number of gig workers, I think it's still a relatively small fraction. So that is going to be the case for many workers, but the majority of gig workers at the end of the day are going to be individuals who are doing this in addition to a wage job. So they're smoothing incomes too, but they're smoothing income on an intensive margin rather than an extensive margin. And I think I mean, my speculation on that is that the earnings are still quite small in these types of platforms, especially when you take into account expenses and so forth. So to really fully sustain yourself on these types of jobs is going to be hard. And so the majority of people are doing this as sort of supplemental work. So it's not thinking about it as replacing existing work, but supplementing some other form of employment.
So now I'm going to take a left turn on you. I, of course, teach a class, ISS 205, to undergraduates, introducing them to econ ideas. And you are so kind every year to give a lecture to them. And the questions that the undergrads posed to you this year that I thought were really challenging to think about had to do with the gendered nature of gig work. And they pointed out that was it Lyft, who now has a policy that if you are a woman, you can, women can, is it the women drivers can pick women rides, or I forget how it went. But again, this idea that since there is less oversight, a female gig worker might feel differently about some jobs than a male gig worker. how's that playing out? Is it Lyft that has the policy? Is it,
I
yeah.
don't know off the top of my head, but I do recall something like this coming into play. I think our numbers do suggest that there is something fundamentally going on during this time period, while you simultaneously have a shift from more transportation, rideshare based, where you're driving around a passenger, to where you're driving around instead, a bag of food or a box of groceries, right? It's different forms of interaction. And so I think that is sort of indicative of what people might be feeling in terms of safety, right? That kind of takes a step back. And if you think about how labor policies are designed, as I said at the beginning of the talk, right, they're all designed around traditional employment. So if you get injured driving, for instance, that you would think of, if you were an employee, would be covered by workers' comp, but these individuals aren't going to be covered by workers' comp, right? So the policies are sort of not designed around these types of these form of employment. But I do think there is something interesting going on that I'd love to explore more. As you can see, sort of the demographics are changing during this time period.
So picking up on what you say about labor policies, so if I'm not mistaken, the Department of Labor has switched whether or not gig workers can unionize. And that again is a right of employees, self-employed can't. Other policies that come to mind, you've mentioned workers' comp, you've mentioned unemployment insurance. I don't know anything about minimum wage and gig workers. What's your sense of all these labor market policies that are floating around? Where do we need to pay the most attention so that gig workers are appropriately covered, or maybe where it's most incongruous for our current labor market policies?
So I think that needs a little bit of research, in the sense that so if you think about employer sponsored benefits, for instance, right? Like that's a big thing that is not currently covered for these employees, but or these individuals. But to the extent that they're employees for someone else, and this is a secondary job, maybe they already have health insurance from their main employer. To the extent that that's true, then I would say maybe that's a less important thing. But for the individuals for whom this is their main job, then that's sort of a critical thing. So again, with every one of these answers, it's sort of going to depend on how you're going to break down the individuals. I will say that, sort of the labor-based, so unemployment, for instance, it would be similar, right? If they have a traditional wage job, they're going to be covered in some sense under that. But things like workers' comp, if you're injured driving a car, it doesn't matter whether you're doing this part-time or full-time, right? So that's something that applies to all of the individuals. So that seems sort of like an important component. And maybe the firms have a specific policy in place, but it's not a federal policy. So that would be interesting to think about. The thing I will say is some states have started. So California is a state that has tried to sort of address this issue by trying to categorize these individuals as employees rather as contract workers, to start to incorporate these types of considerations. And I know other states have sort of dwindled with this, or dabbled in thinking about this from a policy perspective as well. It's sort of, I think, I don't know how to phrase it, but it's sort of a non-centralized way that policymakers are addressing it right now. Is sort of at the state level, wherever they're getting enough sort of motivation and backing. And then at the same time, you also have these firms advocating for whether or not they think they should be contractors. And so it's sort of, there's a lot of tension and not a lot of movement in terms of moving these policies forward. So maybe doing this at a federal level might be more successful than sort of the state-based approach that we have right now. But again, not a policymaker.
Um, I don't want to back up for a moment. What first got you interested in thinking about the gig economy?
So when I first started thinking about the gig economy, I was actually somewhat more of a health economist. So I was thinking and studying the Affordable Care Act at the time and trying to understand, or what I was hoping to do when I got interested in the gig economy was thinking about if you implement a policy like the Affordable Care Act, which expanded the ways in which you can access health insurance, are you going to have increases in self-employment and increased take up in access to health insurance among self-employed individuals? And so in doing that, I sort of went down a rabbit hole of learning all about the gig economy and learned things that gig workers face are far exceed just access to health insurance. And so that's sort of the funny way in which I got into that. And so that's also so a background of why I do health economics as well as labor economics.
Now, in any regular survey that we have done by Bureau of Labor Statistics, trying to get information about the size of self-employment gig economy, I mean, many people who might be an Uber driver, they don't know the distinction between the two. And the piece of your project that always amazes me is your use of tax data. Very clever use of tax data, but also it's hard to use tax data. So is this a 1% sample of tax data? Like, can you tell us a little bit about the tax data that allows you, survey data wouldn't allow to ask any of these questions.
Mhm.
How does this tax data work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the thing with survey data, as you mentioned, is a lot of these individuals, one, they don't understand that they're not an employee, and so they miscategorize themselves. Additionally, surveys generally only ask about your primary form of employment. And so anyone who does this as a secondary form of employment is not going to respond. Sort of the closest thing is, designed surveys that people in this area have created to really target these types of workers. And so sort of the pros of the data that I'm working with is that not only can you sort of ask them specific questions and sort of zoom into those sets of workers, is you can see the entire portfolio. So I can look at and see, is this a fifth of their earnings, or what other form of employment are they doing in addition? And so the key thing here is that you can link together both the contract-based employment earnings as well as the wage earnings if they work for multiple employers. There are, of course, downsides. The way taxes are implemented, everything's at an annual level. So one thing that's very great about surveys is you can understand how many hours people are working. You can actually break that total earnings down into the hours and how much they're earning per hour. And so that is going to be sort of an important part of this. And so, that's going to come from other studies that have looked at data that can really break down that component.
We only got a couple minutes left. My final question for you is this. You're now in your third year here at MSU. What aspects of MSU and MSU economics do you most appreciate?
So yes, it is almost the end of my third academic year here, and I have really enjoyed my time. Um, I, I mean, there's too many things to list, but I would say the economics department is absolutely excellent in their collegialness and friendliness and accessibility. Everyone is happy to, to meet with people, talk about research ideas, and that has been really welcoming as a faculty member. I also teach the 201 class, so I am part of, if you all probably took 201 at some point, so that's the intro principles course. And so I get to interact with a lot of freshmen, a lot of sophomores in their early stages of their economics career. And so that is just really exciting to get to know the undergrads, get to know what they're excited about, talk to them about what economics really is, and really help convince people that economics is a great major. And so that's been really fun over the years, watching the students grow and students come back and say that they've, really enjoyed economics. That's been really fulfilling as a
So how many 201 students did you teach in the fall?
around 1,000, give or take.
Very good. You know all their names.
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. Unfortunately, our time has come to a close. I want to thank you, Emilie, for providing the lecture tonight. I look forward to reading your continued research on the gig economy. I'm a labor economist. I'm an easy sell, though. I also want to thank Katie Fry and Dean Olson for helping make the webinar happen, from putting together the invites to running the webinar itself. But finally, and most importantly, I want to thank you, our alumni. The Department of Economics is what it is today because of the reputation that you have built, based on your many successes and because of your unfailing generosity. Generous alumni provide funding for a host of programming at the undergraduate and graduate level, as well as creating chairs and professorships. In addition, generous alumni have given back with their time and expertise, serving on panels and providing internship opportunities for our undergrads. Please contact me if you'd like to find ways that you can give back to the Department of Economics. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you, Emilie, once again. And again, please do not hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions. So with that, the obligatory go green.
Go white.
Have a good evening.